For 22 years, my world was measured in the scent of chalk dust, floor wax, and the faint, sweet smell of pencil shavings. It was a world I had built, not with bricks and mortar, but with pieces of my own soul. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I was the heart of Northwood Preparatory Academy. Not the principal, not the owner, but something far more vital. I was the head of curriculum, the senior English literature teacher, and, perhaps most importantly, the wife of the man who held the school's deed in his name, Richard. We had started it together, in a rented church basement with 12 students and a shared dream. He was the vision, the ambition, the man who charmed the donors and shook the hands. I was the engine. I was the one who stayed up until 3 a.m. crafting lesson plans that felt more like magic spells, designed to awaken dormant minds. I was the one who knew which students were struggling with a divorce at home, who needed a quiet word of encouragement, who dreamed of being poets or astrophysicists. My days began before sunrise, walking the silent, empty halls, placing a fresh flower on each teacher's desk, feeling the hum of potential in the air. My life was a tapestry woven with the threads of other people's futures. Every scholarship won, every graduation speech, every tearful thank you from a parent, I considered them my own children, my own victories. Richard used to say, I was the school's conscience. He'd kiss my forehead in front of the staff and say, Eleanor is why we're not just a school, but a family. And I believed him. I poured everything I had into that family. Our own home was an extension of the campus. Our dinners were strategy meetings. Our vacations were spent scouting educational conferences. We never had children of our own. Richard had said the school was our child, a legacy that would outlive us both. I accepted that. I nurtured it, sacrificed for it, loved it with a ferocity that left little room for anything else. My identity was so completely entwined with Northwood that I couldn't tell where Eleanor ended and the school began. The day it all shattered was a Tuesday in May, the annual Founders' Day Assembly. The air in the auditorium was thick with anticipation and the cloying scent of parental perfume. I was sitting in the front row, as always, my speech on the importance of community tucked into my program. I felt a familiar swell of pride looking out at the sea of young faces, so many of whom I had personally guided. Richard stepped up to the podium, looking impossibly handsome in his tailored suit, the picture of academic authority. He tapped the microphone, the sound echoing slightly. Good morning, students, faculty, and esteemed parents, he began, his voice smooth as polished mahogany. As we celebrate another year of excellence at Northwood, we also acknowledge that growth requires change. Sometimes that change is difficult, but it is always necessary for progress. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. This wasn't the speech we had discussed. He spoke of new directions, of streamlining our vision, of injecting fresh perspectives. The words were corporate, cold, and utterly alien to the ethos I had spent 2 decades building. He then introduced a new strategic partner, a young, ambitious woman named Amelia, whose resume he lauded with a little too much enthusiasm. I watched her stand and give a small, confident wave. I had seen her around campus, a new history teacher, pretty, sharp, in her late 20s. I felt a pang of something I couldn't name. Then, Richard cleared his throat. This new chapter also means we must say goodbye to the old. My blood ran cold. He looked out over the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces, but he wouldn't look at me. He never once looked at me. After long and careful consideration, the board and I had decided to restructure the head of curriculum position. We are moving in a more technologically integrated direction, and we feel a new leadership style is required to take us into the future.
He was talking about me.
He was doing this here in front of everyone, in front of my students, my colleagues, the parents who had trusted me with their children. My breath caught in my throat. It felt like the air was being vacuumed from the room. I could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes turning towards me, a symphony of pity, confusion, and morbid curiosity. He was firing me.
Publicly.
But it was the next sentence that truly broke me. On a personal note, he continued, a practiced, solemn expression on his face, Eleanor and I have also decided to end our marriage. We wish each other the best in our separate futures. He said it with the same emotional detachment as announcing a change in the lunch menu. My husband, The man whose dreams I had carried on my back for 22 years was ending our life together as a footnote in a school assembly. He then smiled, a brilliant, false smile, and gestured to Amelia, who was now standing beside him. And I am personally very excited to announce that Amelia will not only be stepping into a new senior administrative role, but she has also agreed to be my wife. The collective gasp in the auditorium was a physical blow. The world tilted, the faces in the crowd blurring into a watercolor wash of horror. My hearing faded to a dull roar. He had not only replaced me, he had replaced me with her, in my job and in my home, and announced it to the world as a triumphant act of progress. I stood up, my legs trembling uncontrollably. I don't remember making the decision to move, but I was suddenly walking, stumbling up the aisle, the whispers following me like a swarm of angry bees. The back doors of the auditorium seemed a million miles away. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The man I loved, the life I had built, the identity I had cherished, it had all been executed, right there on stage, and I was the only one who hadn't known it was coming. In that moment, my chow disappeared. It was the deepest pain I have ever felt. If you have ever experienced a great disappointment and understand what it is to have your heart broken, please like this video so I know I am not alone on this journey. The weeks that followed were a colorless fog.
I was a ghost in my own life.
Richard, through his lawyer, gave me 2 weeks to vacate our home. The home I had decorated, the garden I had tended, the rooms that held every memory we had ever made. I packed my life into cardboard boxes, each object a tiny shard of a shattered mirror, reflecting a past that was no longer mine. Friends from the school, people I had considered family, stopped calling. Their loyalty, it turned out, was to the institution, to the man who signed their paychecks, not to the woman who had held their hands and championed their careers. I was a pariah, a symbol of a past Richard was determined to erase. I ended up in a small, damp basement apartment on the other side of town. The kind of place with windows so high you could only see people's feet as they walked by. The silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. For 22 years, my life had been a constant hum of bells, chatter, and purpose. Now there was nothing. Just the drip of a faulty faucet and the frantic, looping monologue in my own head. What did I do wrong? How could I have been so blind? I replayed that assembly over and over, his words echoing in the empty rooms, each syllable another twist of the knife. I tried to find another teaching job, but the doors were silently, politely closed. Richard's influence in the local education community was absolute. My reputation, once my most prized possession, had been systematically dismantled. I was difficult, outdated, resistant to change. The lies he had spun to justify his cruelty became my new, unwritten resume. I was 48 years old, with a lifetime of experience that was suddenly worthless. My savings dwindled. I took a job stocking shelves at a grocery store overnight, the fluorescent lights humming a mournful tune as I placed cans of soup in perfect, soulless rows. My hands, which had once corrected essays on Shakespeare and held the hands of nervous students, were now calloused and sore. I felt invisible, erased. My spirit, which had once burned so brightly, was a pile of cold ash. This was my bottom. A lonely woman in a basement apartment, smelling of canned peas and despair, mourning a life that felt like it had belonged to someone else entirely. One rainy Saturday, drowning in self-pity, I decided to finally unpack the last box from my old life. It was labeled personal. Inside were old photo albums, college yearbooks, and a small, cedar box that had belonged to my grandmother. My grandmother was a force of nature, a woman who had survived the Depression and raised 5 children with little more than grit and wisdom. As I ran my fingers over the worn wood, I remembered her hands, strong and gentle, and her voice, which always sounded like home. I opened the box. Tucked beneath some old, lace-trimmed handkerchiefs was a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, its creases worn soft as cloth. I unfolded it carefully. It was a note, written in her elegant, looping cursive. I had been about 10 years old when she gave it to me, after I had failed a math test and declared I was too stupid to ever learn anything. She had sat me down, held my face in her hands, and told me, "Your mind is a garden, Eleanor. Don't let one weed convince you that you can't grow flowers." Later that day, she had slipped me this note. I had kept it in my jewelry box for years, a forgotten talisman. Now, in the dim light of my basement apartment, I read the words again. They were simple, but they landed in my desolate soul like a seed. A mind, once opened, can never be closed. A spirit, once freed, can never be caged. I traced the letters with my finger. A spirit, once freed, can never be caged. My spirit felt not just caged, but dead. Yet, holding that piece of paper, I felt the faintest tremor of something. A memory. An echo of the girl I was before Northwood, before Richard, before the world told me my worth was tied to a job title and a man's approval. I was the girl who loved to learn, not for a grade, but for the thrill of it. The girl who believed in the magic of a single, well-chosen word. The note was a key. It didn't magically unlock the door to my prison of despair, but it showed me there was a door. It was a tiny, fragile spark in the overwhelming darkness. I smoothed the note out on the table, its crumpled surface a map of my own life, folded, creased, but not torn. I propped it up against a salt shaker on my small kitchen table, the only piece of art in my bleak apartment. It was all I had left of a belief in myself. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a solution. But it was a beginning. It was a whisper that maybe, just maybe, my story wasn't over after all. That crumpled note became my scripture. I carried it with me everywhere, in my pocket, pulling it out and reading it when the despair threatened to swallow me whole. A spirit, once freed, can never be caged. I started to ask myself, when had my spirit ever truly been free? At Northwood, I had served Richard's vision, his ambition. My work had been for the school, for him, not for me. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating. What if I started something just for myself? I began small. I put up a flyer on the community board at the grocery store. Personalized tutoring. All subjects, all ages. Let's unlock your mind. My first call was from a woman named Maria, a single mother whose 14-year-old son, Leo, was failing 3 classes and on the verge of being expelled. He was, in her words, a lost cause. When Leo slumped into my apartment for his first session, he was a fortress of teenage apathy. Hood up, eyes down, monosyllabic answers. The system had labeled him a failure, and he had accepted his cage. I didn't start with algebra or history. I started with him. I asked him what he liked. After a week of sullen silence, he finally mumbled, building things, taking them apart. The next session, I had an old, broken lawnmower engine on my kitchen floor. I told him our lesson was to figure out how it worked. For the first time, I saw a flicker of interest in his eyes. We spent a month taking apart that engine, cleaning the parts, and putting it back together. I used it to teach him physics, fractions, problem solving. I showed him how the principles in his textbooks weren't just abstract rules. They were the language that explained how the world worked. The day we got the engine to sputter back to life, Leo's smile was like the sun coming out. He wasn't just fixing an engine, he was fixing his own belief in himself. His grades began to climb, but more importantly, he started looking people in the eye. He took his hood down. He had uncaged his own spirit. Maria, ecstatic, told another parent. That parent told 2 more. Soon, my tiny basement apartment was overflowing with the lost causes of the public school system. Kids with ADHD who couldn't sit still in a rigid classroom, brilliant dyslexic students who had been dismissed as slow, anxious children who were terrified of being called on. I didn't use a standard curriculum. My method was the message on the note. I sought to open their minds, not just fill them. We learned history by cooking meals from different eras. We learned biology by planting a garden in window boxes. We learned literature by writing our own plays and performing them for each other. It was chaotic, exhausting, and the most fulfilling work I had ever done. The first real sign that this was becoming something more was when Maria handed me an envelope thick with cash. "This is from me and 5 other parents," she said, her eyes shining with tears. "It's not much, but we want you to find a bigger place. You're building something important here, Eleanor. A lifeboat." That money was my first real investment in my new life. I rented a small, forgotten storefront with a leaky roof and peeling paint. The parents organized a weekend work party. We patched the roof, painted the walls bright colors, and built tables out of old doors. We called it the Open Mind Collective. It wasn't a school, not officially. It was a haven. Leo, now a confident young man, became my de facto assistant, helping the younger kids with their projects. One afternoon, a young girl named Maya, who hadn't spoken a word in her regular school for a year due to crippling anxiety, stood up in the middle of our workshop and recited a poem she had written. It was about a bird with a broken wing learning to fly again. In that moment, watching the pride and relief on the faces of the other children as they applauded her, I felt a sense of purpose so profound it brought tears to my eyes. This was my legacy. Not a grand building with a benefactor's name on it, but a small room filled with mended wings. Word of mouth was a powerful thing. My reputation grew, not as the disgraced wife of Richard Vance, but as the woman who worked miracles with the kids no one else wanted. I went from survivor to founder. Success wasn't a plaque on a wall. It was the sound of laughter in a place that had once been silent. It was there, with my own hands, covered in paint and soil and chalk dust, that I began to rewrite my story. I stopped being the victim and became the author of my own destiny. If my journey of overcoming is inspiring you, subscribe to the channel to follow the next chapters and become part of this community of new beginnings. Years passed. The Open Mind Collective thrived. We eventually had to move to a larger building, an old warehouse we renovated into a vibrant, open-plan learning space. We had a waiting list a mile long and a team of passionate educators who believed in our philosophy. We were getting national attention for our alternative approach, a model for how to educate the whole child, not just the test taker. I hadn't seen or spoken to Richard in almost a decade. He was a phantom from another life. Northwood, I had heard, had become a cold, data-driven institution, prized for its test scores but devoid of the warmth it once had. Then, one afternoon, my assistant told me I had a visitor. And there he was, standing in the entrance of my vibrant, chaotic, joyful school. Richard. He looked older, thinner, the confident swagger replaced by a subtle air of desperation. He looked around at the student-painted murals, the noisy, engaged children, the atmosphere of creative freedom. His expression was a mixture of disbelief and something I could almost mistake for envy. "Eleanor," he said, his voice hesitant. "You've built something quite remarkable here." I didn't offer him a seat. I just stood there, grounded in my space, my world. "What do you want, Richard?" He launched into a prepared speech. Northwood was facing an enrollment crisis. A recent scandal involving pressure to cheat on standardized tests had tarnished its reputation. The Amelia Vance era, as he called it, had been a disaster. They were now divorced. He was here to offer me a proposition. He wanted to merge the Open Mind Collective with Northwood. He offered me my old job back, head of everything, as he put it. He said the school needed me, that it needed its conscience back. He was offering me the keys to the kingdom I had been exiled from. The old Eleanor would have felt a surge of vindication, a desire to see him grovel. But I wasn't the old Eleanor. I listened calmly until he was finished. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the happy noise of my students in the next room. "No," I said. It was a simple, quiet word, but it held the weight of a decade of healing. He blinked, stunned.
No?
"Eleanor, this is your chance to come back, to have everything you lost." I almost laughed. What I lost? "Richard, you didn't just fire me from a job. You tried to extinguish my spirit. You took my life's work and my personal life and you set them on fire in a public square for your own convenience." He started to stammer an apology, but I held up a hand. "It's not about forgiveness, Richard. It's about understanding. You see this place." I gestured around the room. This was built from the ashes of that fire. It was built on a principle you would never understand. This place isn't about reputation or test scores or charming donors. It's about setting spirits free. Northwood was your cage, Richard. A beautiful, gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. I have no desire to go back inside. He looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time, and I think he finally saw that the fragile woman he had discarded was gone forever. In her place was someone who had built her own world, on her own terms. He left without another word. That was my final confrontation. It wasn't a shout, it was a quiet declaration of my own sovereignty. My peace didn't come from his apology or his defeat. It came from the profound realization that I no longer needed anything from him at all. Today, the Open Mind Collective is a fully accredited K-12 school. We are a beacon for students who need a different way to learn. My greatest joy is our graduation ceremony. It's not a stuffy, formal affair. The students share their journeys, they perform, they celebrate their unique paths. And at the end, I hand each of them their diploma. On the bottom of every single one, printed in elegant script, is a quote. It's the message from that crumpled, yellowed note I found in my darkest hour, the words that became my foundation. A mind, once opened, can never be closed. A spirit, once freed, can never be caged. It is my legacy. It is the truth I found in the wreckage of my old life. My peace is here, in the daily miracle of watching young minds and spirits discover their own freedom. Today, I understand that the wounds of the past do not define who we are, but what we do with them does. Thank you so much for listening to my story to the end. If it has touched you, share it with someone who needs a light, and leave a comment with a word of strength and hope. Together, we are stronger.